you have your Bibles with you, would you open them now to John chapter 2? John 2, verses 1 to 11 are the text that we'll look at today. If you're new to Windermere, one of the normal ways that I preach, probably the normal way that I preach, is to preach through books of the Bible. Now, if it's a really long book, we try to take breaks here and there so that we don't get burned out on one particular book. But we're new. We're new in the Gospel of John, and so we find ourselves opening up today where we left off. John chapter 2, in the first verse, we see that Jesus 2 weeks ago was baptized in the Jordan River, beginning his ministry. And then now he was called disciples to himself last week. And he leaves that place down in the Jordan River near Jerusalem, and he goes back to his the region of his hometown, Nazareth, not far from there in the city of Cana. And so that's where we pick up today. John chapter 2 in verses 1 to 11. Once again, let's listen to God's word. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "What business do you have with me, woman? My hour is not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he tells you, do it." Let me stop there and just give a couple of things that add some context for us. First of all, Cana is about 10 miles north of Nazareth, which is where Jesus grew up, his boyhood hometown. He probably would have made hundreds and hundreds of trips to Cana throughout his lifetime, and probably would have known lots of people there, maybe even relatives who lived in the land of Cana. That, in addition to the fact that Jesus and his mother and his disciples were all invited to this wedding, help us to understand that this wedding he's at is probably a family wedding. It's probably a cousin or something like that. And even if it's not a family wedding, it's at least someone who's very, very close to Jesus' family. Mary has a very vested interest, and obviously then so does Jesus, in this wedding going well. Which helps us kind of understand a little bit more about what happens next. Mary comes and says, "They have no wine." That was a big deal in those days. Hospitality was so important. So many places in the Bible, if you didn't show hospitality in the ancient world, it was almost like you'd committed murder, because the ancient world was harsh and cruel. And if you were going to invite people to come walking and on camels for days and days to come to this wedding, you better provide something for them. Show hospitality for them there. And so wine was a part of a sign of respect and hospitality for all of your invited guests. And this reception would go on for days, but you needed to make sure that you had planned well in advance to have enough wine for your guest. And so what a disgrace it would have been, how shameful it would have been if they'd run out of wine, and indeed, they did. They ran out. And so Mary comes to Jesus and tells him this. They've run out of wine. And isn't it kind of shocking what Jesus says to his own mom? He says, "This has nothing to do with my ministry. Why are you telling me this, Mom? Why are you telling me?" If I were Mary, I think I might have responded differently. Like, "Young man, do you know who you're talking to? I'm your mother." But instead, she responds very differently. She understands who he is, the Lord of heaven and earth. And she's been with him his entire boyhood into this early manhood now, and she knows her son. And she knows that she can trust in his mercy. And that if she simply tells the servants, "Do whatever he says," she knows that he's going to act mercifully. She doesn't know what he's going to do, but she knows that he will bring about the most merciful result possible, because Jesus is merciful. So let's see what does happen. Verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water pots standing there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 2 or 3 measures each. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." So they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some water out now and take it to the head waiter." And they took it to him. And when the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, and didn't know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the groom and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first, and then when the guests are drunk, then he serves the poorer wine. But you've kept the good wine until now." This is the beginning of his signs Jesus did and kept This is the beginning of his signs that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. One of the things that helps us understand a little bit more again about the context of this, these purification pots were at any Jewish event. And the reason is if you came into the event, especially if you went inside, you had to have enough water to wash your hands and feet. In those days, they would walk around in sandals and dusty roads. They weren't paved. And so you'd have very dirty feet and very dirty hands, and Jews were very impressed with cleanliness, and so they wanted to make sure there was enough water to make sure you were very, very clean. That's why they had to have all these jars and be ready to fill them with good water. Each one of these purification jars held 20 to 30 gallons. 20 to 30 gallons each. And there were 6 of them. So presumably, Jesus made somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons of wine. Can you imagine? That's a lot of wine. 120 to 180 gallons of wine. And this is presumably just some sort of a small family and friends wedding. It goes on for a few days, but that's a lot of wine for those few people. Verse 10 even implies that the guests are already drunk. Why do they need that much wine when it's already that far into the party? Reminds me of a story about a Lutheran pastor who was coming back from a wedding he had officiated at, so he still had his clergy collar on. He was driving home, and he gets pulled over by a state trooper. State trooper walks up, knocks on the window. The Lutheran pastor rolls his window. That's not how you roll windows down anymore, is it? It's like just a button. He rolls his window down. The officer looks in the car, and he sees a glass of wine in the console, and he smells alcohol coming out of the car. He says, "Reverend, have you been drinking today?" The Lutheran pastor looks at the trooper and says, "Sir, I've only had water today." He says, "Reverend, I find that hard to believe. I smell alcohol on your breath." And the pastor looks down and he sees the wine in the console and he says, "Oh, good Lord, he did it again." Is that why Jesus changed that water into wine, so that they could just, get further drunk? I don't think so. There's a couple of things we need to understand. The process of making wine in Jesus' time was a little different than it is now. When they made wine in Jesus' time, the final yield, the product that you would actually drink after it had been produced and then added the appropriate amount of water, it usually had an alcohol content of about 2 to 3% alcohol by volume. Compare that to today's wine, which is anywhere from 10 to 18%. So it's much stronger today than it was then. Now that doesn't mean you couldn't get drunk on it. There were certainly writings in the New Testament that said drunkenness had been a problem in some places. But it does mean that the guests at this party are probably not what we're thinking of when we think of drunk. This isn't like college frat party drunk, right? This is indicating something different. These guests are having a good time. They're fellowshipping with one another, and they see the wine as a sign of God's presence and His grace among them. Psalm 104 verse 15 in fact says, "Wine which makes man's heart glad, so that he may make his face glisten with oil, and food which sustains his heart." So the better sense of understanding this text is not that Jesus gave wine to already drunk people for their debauchery. No. It's more like understanding God's blessing for these people and His continued blessing for them. R.C. Sproul says that, in remarking on these comments, said that weddings are the last vestige of a pre-fallen world, which is really interesting. Because if you think about it, weddings existed before the fall. Adam and Eve, man and woman, became one flesh together. It existed before sin existed. Weddings did. Unions between man and woman did. And then as you look into the New Testament, you see these wonderful examples of what redemption is like. And it points to a bride and a bridegroom, a wedding feast. These are images of heaven, of glory, of redemption. Even look to the book of Revelation and you see the church coming down like a bride adorned for her groom. And so this wedding feast here is one brief moment when heaven is breaking into earth. This wonderful image of love and fellowship and blessing and joy. And so when we think about it that way, the question is not, is Jesus going to let them run out of wine? The question is Jesus going to let the sign of God's blessing and his heaven and his joy end in disgrace? And definitively, Jesus answers that question, no. It won't end in disgrace. It'll end in abundance. Abundance. 150 gallons, more than anyone else there could drink over days and days and days. It wasn't intended for them to drink it all. It was intended for them to see that God's abundance was overwhelming, more than they needed. And good wine at that. It's a sign that in the person of Jesus Christ, there is more blessing from God than we could ever imagine. So let me make application for a few minutes. As we reflect back on this story, it occurs to me that there are really two things that make this miracle possible. Two things that also happen in our life regularly. One of them is need. Need. And the second one is a trust in Jesus. A need and then a trust. The first of the things here that results in a need is an error. It's a mistake. Before the party began, the groom somehow did not plan for enough wine for his guest, which would have brought a great deal of guilt and shame on him. Imagine how the groom feels when the waiter comes to him and says, we just served the last glass of wine and your guests are still drinking. I hope you have something in reserve, because otherwise this is going to be a great shame for your family. Have you ever made a terrible mistake that brought shame on you or your family? Maybe you're hearing this morning and your life has actually been a pattern of guilt and things that have brought decisions that have brought shame on you or on your family. And it won't be long before that shame and that guilt become unbearable. Man, it's a painful position to be in. I know that. I've been there too. It's a painful position to be in, and yet it's because of that error, because of those empty jars there, it creates a space for Jesus to show himself as glorious. Not just willing to help, but willing to restore to his family to exceeding abundance and honor and blessing. People looked at the end of the wedding and they said, wow, the end of this wedding was better than the beginning of it. When does that ever happen? And yet I promise you this, that if you'll open up that broken, shameful, empty place in your life and say, Lord, I can't save myself, I need you here. If you'll express that need, then people will look at your life and they'll say, wow, the end of it was better than its beginning. The second condition that made this miracle possible was Mary's trust in Jesus. Mary's trust specifically in his mercy, that he would show mercy to this groom and this family. Did you notice that when Mary spoke with her son, she only spoke of her need, of the need of the moment? She says in verse 3, they have no wine. As I mentioned earlier, she doesn't say, Jesus, I'm your mother. I changed your diapers. You owe me one here. Actually, the opposite's true. Jesus says to his mother, what does this have to do with me? She doesn't try to coerce him or persuade him or bargain with him. Here's what she does. She just trusts him. She just trusts him. She said, okay, Jesus. Then she turns to the servants and says, do whatever he says. Whatever he says will make it right. She trusts her son. She knows he's merciful. So often we get into positions of panic or desperation, and our first thought is to begin to bargain, to negotiate with God. Oh God, if you'll get me out of this spot, then I'll go to church. I'll turn my life around. I'll give to charity. I'll volunteer on the weekends. And if at any time this has been your approach, and I'm not pointing a finger, I've been there too. I've done the negotiation thing before. Probably everybody in this room has at some point. But when you're there, the response is the same. Oh man, oh woman, what does this have to do with me? Jesus says. God doesn't need your money. He doesn't need your charity. He doesn't need your time. You don't have a position to negotiate. You don't have any leverage with God. He doesn't need anything. There's a difference between trusting in our ability and trusting in the mercy of Jesus. When we're negotiating with God, what we're trusting is in our ability to do what we say we're going to do in order to get in exchange something else. But when we abandon trust in our ability and we put our trust wholly in God, we say, Lord, whatever you say is right. I trust you. I trust your mercy. If Mary were to approach Jesus saying, listen here, young man, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm your mom, then it would have been asking Jesus to do something out of obligation to her instead of one of trust. Too many of us are frustrated in our relationships with God because we keep coming to Him with a paradigm of obligation, a quid pro quo. You do this for me, God, I'll do that for you. We can't understand why our marriage isn't working, why our career isn't working, why we keep having health problems, when in the meantime, we're going to church, we're reading the Bible, we're helping people out. Isn't God seeing all these good things that I'm doing? Why is this still happening to me? Oh, guess what? He sees perfectly. He sees perfectly what you're doing. You're the one who hasn't been seeing. He doesn't want your stuff. He doesn't want your time. He doesn't want your money. He doesn't want your effort. He wants you to trust Him. When the wine is gone, He wants you to trust Him. When the test results come back and it's bad news, He wants you to trust Him. When the job is lost, when the marriage is over, when the career is gone, it's not a moment to negotiate with Him. He wants you to trust Him in that moment. On the other hand, I believe that there are at least some people who will hear this message here today who have never come to Jesus at all. Ironically, really, for the same reason. Somewhere down the line, we convince ourselves that if Jesus is going to do anything for us, we got to get our lives together first. It's a false thought, but so many people think that. If I'm going to come to Jesus, I got to be better than this. People think I can't go to church. I drink too much. Jesus wouldn't care too much for me. I've got a foul mouth and a short temper. Jesus doesn't love people like me, people with a past like I've got. Well, we've just gone too far down the line. But Jesus' response is the same. What are you talking about? What does that have to do with me? The assumption under all that thinking is that Jesus needs something from you. First, He needs you to quit drinking, or He needs you to clean up your act, or He needs you to be more respectable. But remember, Jesus is God and He needs nothing. He needs nothing. Well, then what's the point of Jesus' ministry? That's why this miracle is so beautiful. It points us in the right direction. He's come to find people who are completely empty. He's come to find people who are embarrassingly in need, and then to give them unbelievable measures of His grace and His love. Maybe you're listening to this at home, and you're sitting there in front of your computer. I don't know. Maybe you're drunk or high listening to this. Maybe you're hearing this and you don't know how you're going to pay your next bill. Maybe your marriage is falling apart. Maybe you're depressed. Maybe you've been thinking about suicide because you're at the end of your rope. And you're thinking, I can't turn to Jesus. I can't because I have nothing to offer. Listen to me. The fact that you have nothing to offer makes you the perfect candidate for Jesus. He didn't come to a wedding that still had plenty of wine and just add a little bit extra to it. That's not what He's about. He comes into lives that are shamefully empty, and He fills them with the best of God's blessings. Now, I understand maybe where you're at, you can't see that right now. But can you see that in this story? The wine has run out. And if the guest had left at that point, if the groom had given up, they would have missed the best, most abundant part of God's grace. It's only in that hour of need that Jesus begins to step in and show Himself glorious God. If you're at that low point in your life and you're feeling like you have nothing left to offer, can I invite you today to do what Mary did? To trust Jesus, to just say, whatever he says, I'll do. Trust in the mercy of Jesus. She didn't know what he was about to do. And the same is true in your life. You don't know what God's about to do with you. You don't. You might think you know, but you have no idea. But I do know this. I know this. I know that if you'll trust in Jesus, he will be merciful beyond measure. He will bring forth from the divine vintage God's grace and forgiveness and goodness. Not because he's obligated to do so for you, but because he loves you. May this word be to the glory of God and for the joy of his people. Amen.